Hey everyone, this is Josh, and today we're going to talk about demystifying the Procreate 5 brush engine. It is newly revamped and overhauled, and there's a lot of details to get into, but I want you guys to be able to get comfortable with it so that you can create your own brushes like I do. Now, in order to make this tutorial a little bit more interesting, let's start out by creating our own brush. And in order to do that, we're going to need two things. We're going to need two images, an image for the brush shape and an image for the brush grain. And so today I'm going to use my dead cat here and see what happens. I have no idea how this is going to turn out, but I think it'll make this a little bit more interesting since it's going to take a while to go through a lot of these intricate details here. So I already went ahead and took a photo of my dead cat and used that as a reference. As you can see here, this is the original photo. Then I went into Photoshop and corrected the image a little bit for a good shape and texture image. So if you look at here, this is what would be a good image to use as a shape. You want it to be transparent and only have the shape in the foreground as a variation of a very light color with some darker details in there. And then for the texture, you want to create ideally a repeating texture and zoom into the image and then kind of massage the seams that would occur when you start to work with that. And I'm sure that can sound a little bit confusing if you're not used to making textures in Photoshop, but I'll have to save that for another video because it can be time consuming depending on how good you want your texture to be. Okay, so we've finally gotten into a new document here in Procreate and we can finally start working on our new brush. And so to start off, you can make a new brush by double tapping or single tapping on a brush you've already made or pressing the plus icon here. I prefer this way because this allows you to import brushes, as you can see right there. If you don't do that, and you just click on a brush, you won't be able to import stuff. So just keep that in mind. I was confused by that before and I want to make sure you guys know so that you don't have those problems. If we start by hitting the plus icon, it starts a completely new default brush set, which is different from Procreate 4. That wasn't an option. You just had to duplicate and work from there. The layout for the brush menu is basically you have all of your attributes here, then you have your settings in the middle, and then you have your drawing pad on the right. And your drawing pad is customizable. You can clear your drawing pad like that. You can change the color of your brush. And if I get my Apple Pencil here, we can use something more appropriate to the Josh branding of this channel. And then we can also change the size of the brush as well, just like that. And so what's cool about the drawing pad is as you change the settings, it will update what you've already drawn, as you can see there. So that's really cool. But because of that, keep that in mind, you won't be able to draw as much without the brush starting to reset what you've done. As you can see there, it's kind of like how if you shoot a wall in a video game, eventually the bullet holes will start to disappear. That's kind of what will eventually happen when you start adding a lot more complexity to your brushes. So just to keep that in mind, I want to let you guys know in advance, these settings or attributes here have different levels of complexity. So I will tell you from my own personal opinion, the stroke path is pretty easy. Taper, I'd say that's a medium difficulty, but it's very easy to get used to. Shape, fairly easy. There's just a lot of different settings here. Grain, I would say this is medium. You can really get into this. Rendering, I'd say that's starting to get more complex because it's difficult to see what these settings start to do. You have to test a lot of these and come back and test them again once you change settings. Same with wet mix. This basically transforms your brush into a real paintbrush. It starts to act like a real paintbrush. And so it can be really messy trying to figure out what exactly these settings do. And a lot of them don't feel like they do anything. Color dynamics is also one of the more complex attributes because there's so many different ways you can have the colors change as you paint. And it requires a decent, I'd say at least a little bit of knowledge of color theory to really get this to work in your favor. And then you have dynamics. I'd say this is super easy. Apple Pencil, this is medium to easy. There's a good fair bit of settings here, but I think for most people you won't be trying to utilize the tilt a lot, so a lot of your settings are just going to be focused on pressure. And then properties and then the about this brush are just very simple things that you don't even really have to pay attention to a lot of the time. Sometimes I like to come here and change the sizing, but we'll get to that later. So that's the basic overview of the brush engine, and now we're just going to go ahead and get right into the settings. So before we actually go in order from stroke path all the way to the about section, let's go ahead and import our shape and texture into the brush. For shape, we can go into edit right here, and then this brings up the shape editor. We can go to import and go into, actually, let's show you guys the source library. So this is the default shapes that Procreate has, and there's quite a bit of them, and you can really create a wide range of brushes from just this library alone. But we're actually going to go to the file that I brought into Procreate, and so that's going to be the PNG file here, and you can see here this is the shape I already have, and so that brings in pretty nicely there, and we're going to hit done. And as you can see, my brush is starting to have its own attributes here. It's got a very dusty edge to it. It's really cool. I'm pretty happy with how this looks. And so now let's also go into the grain, which is going to be our texture. And so we can go into edit here, and you can import again. There's a source library. Just want to show you guys what this is. It's the default source library that Procreate comes with. Very, very nice. This is part of the reason I love Procreate so much. You can just start here and just make whatever you want, but we're going to go again with the texture that we already made, and that's there. And we're going to hit done. And as you can see now, my brush has a very obvious texture to it that's going from the grain source that I just set. So now we're going to go back into stroke path and clear the drawing pad and start seeing what these different settings do. Alright, so after adding the brush shape and the grain or the texture, let's get into the stroke path, which is super easy to get into. So I'm going to draw a stroke really quick here, and basically the first one, all spacing does is change how many instances or how many stamps are there when the program tries to create a brush stroke. So I should explain how it works actually. When you're drawing a line, it's actually creating a series of stamps of your brush. And so when you have the spacing up set very high, like 63% here, you can actually see every single stamp. But in reality, brushes don't look like that. They look like a smooth, consistent texture, like a clear stroke. And so you really want to set the spacing up much lower. Usually around 10% is really how it starts to look much better. However, the lower your spacing is, the more demanding it will be on your computer. So the iPad tends to handle this well. If you have an iPad Air, should be pretty good, but if you have the iPad 7th gen or below, you really want to be careful of how many brushes you have set to spacing 1 or 0, especially when you start adding more complex grain, shape, and all these different things going on. Streamline, all this does is it's like the S or smoothing modifier if you're used to something like what is it called, Paint Tool Sai and or Manga Studio. So this basically makes it easier for you to draw curves and straight lines. You can see it starts to look like there's a delay, and that's basically because it's trying to approximate ideal curve based on what I'm doing on the screen. And so if I were to try to do that again with no streamline, you can see there it actually updates. It just smooths everything out. It makes it a little bit more accurate. So that's really good if you're trying to create a inking brush. And then jitter, what jitter does is it just starts to shake around each stamp. And so you can see when the jitter is set to 0, the stamps are all in line. But when you start to increase it, it starts to get really fuzzy. It starts to make the brush, you can see the stamps are slightly out of line, and if I move it all the way up, you can see it just looks like a complete mess here. And so this is usually good for if you're trying to create a blending brush. This can be really nice and really make your blends feel very organic. I think I might actually want to go for that kind of brush for this. I'm going to play with these a little bit. Fall off, what that does is if I clear the pad here, fall off basically increases the strength to which, or decreases the strength to which the brush opacity is based on the distance from the end of the stroke. So as you can see here, as I increase it, the stroke at the end begins to get lighter and lighter and lighter. So I'll I'll leave that to 0 for here because I don't think I'm going to need that too much. So let's go ahead and move on to the next attribute, which is taper. So for taper, this brush isn't really going to show it as well, so I'm going to go ahead and hit done. And then I'm going to go ahead and duplicate one of my brushes. Let's go to the sharp detail brush and let's bring that up. Okay, so now that we've made that brush, what we need to do is start to change this diagram. And so this diagram is going to allow us to change the tip of our brush stroke from being thin to thick. And you're not going to see anything really change until you change that diagram. So make sure to keep that in mind. The link tip size is going to make sure that it stays linked from the beginning to the end. If you don't do that, then you can change the end of your stroke if you like. But I prefer to keep it mostly the same. And so once you have that done, I'm going to make it extreme so that for demonstration purposes, you can see size starts to make the tip very, very thin or not very thick, but much thinner than you could by just changing this diagram. Opacity doesn't really change too much. You can see it's barely changing the opacity at the end of the stroke, but doesn't really do too much. You don't need to worry about that one. You can see pressure starts to respond more based on the pressure of your pencil. So if you change the setting to be very high, it's really going to jack up the thickness based on your pressure and really make it impossibly thin at the beginning of your stroke. And then if you bring it back here, it will be a little bit more gradual. And then tip somewhat looks like it affects the texture. It kind of works the same way as size, but it's just another way to affect the taper of your stroke. Tip animation, I really am not sure I understand what this does. I think it shows the tip being stroked. Yeah, it shows the tip actually changing, but to be honest, I don't really see much of a difference between both ways. So you can just leave this on or off in my opinion. And then touch taper, I'm not going to really go over because it's all based on your touch sensitivity for your own finger. But this thing right here is very important. So if I clear the drawing pad and draw a few straight lines, if you notice this, with classic taper on, you can see the taper is really strong and responsive at the beginning of the stroke, but at the end, it's really not changing too much. And so what classic taper does is, if you turn that off, it kind of neutralizes everything and makes it more even. And so I recommend you do this. This was a complaint I had with Procreate 4, and I much prefer this tapering method where it's much more consistent at the beginning and the end of your stroke. So I would try and keep that off if I were you. And so that's pretty much it for taper. There's a lot to get into, but once you've tried it a little bit, it's pretty easy. So now let's get more into the shape brush. So scatter is the first setting we have here, and that kind of starts to mess around. It starts to act like jitter basically from stroke path, and it starts to scatter the stamps of your brush. As you see, it's a lot more subtle than the jitter, but it kind of messes them around within their own little area. And count basically starts to add more and more different scattered stamps, which makes your brush more opaque. So let's say I increase the count, it kind of gets ridiculous here. And there's just so much of the brush being applied that it's very opaque. I'm actually going to go back and make this pink. I don't remember how we lost our Ergo Josh color there. You can see I actually do like how this looks. I just hope it wouldn't be too taxing on my iPad when I start using this brush at a large size. And then rotation will change how your brush looks as it's rotated based on your pencil. To show this, I'm going to go over to this pressure or shape graph, and so I can kind of squash the shape, and so this basically becomes like an oval. As I change this down, it's going to change the roundness. Actually, it's not doing that. That's weird. I think this might be based on another setting, but yeah, this is why, some of these settings can be interesting and tricky because they're going to override each other. So if we go back up here, you can see randomized just randomizes the scatter and count settings that you have, and then count jitter also adds jitter to the count as well. Just a lot of things to make your brush more organic looking. Azimuth changes how your brush, you won't be able to see it much here. Like I said, there's a lot of settings here that really, it's very confusing, but a lot of these settings won't apply to a lot of different brush types. And so azimuth is really good for making calligraphy brushes. It will detect the angle that your brush is at and start to warp the shape that way. And then flip X and Y will just flip the orientation of your brush shape within all of the different stamps that are created as you draw your brush stroke. If we come down here, pressure roundness will change the shape of your brush here based on the pressure, but again, it's already not really changing much, so we won't worry about that. And then tilt roundness will change the shape of your brush based on the tilt, and you can see it's starting to work there. It just appears to get bigger and smaller rather than being squashed, but I think that's just based on the jitter settings I have and the shape of my brush to begin with. And filtering, what this does is it affects the edges of your brush, and so if I click no filtering, it's hard to tell, but the brush will be very sharp on the edges. And then classic filtering makes it a little bit smoother, a little bit more anti-aliased, which is the correct word from it, looking at the the manual. And improve filtering is the best. And so I'm actually going to leave it to improve filtering because I'm wanting to use this as a more blending organic brush to start off with. Hopefully that is enough to get you guys your feet in the water for the shape source settings. Okay, so now let's get into the grain, which is one of my favorite ones to change. So to start off, moving basically makes your grain kind of roll as a roller. If you think of a paint roller rolling across your iPad, that's kind of how the grain is going to move as you draw your stroke. But texturized is going to act as if you had a texture behind your iPad and you're etching away and you're slowly revealing the texture that's already there. So as you can see here, it's like I'm revealing this texture. That's going to be useful for a very specific type of brush and not something that I would be interested in. So I'm going to stick to moving. And then rolling basically is, you can think of it as a slow slider between these two different points. So if I change this to stamp, you can't really see much of the texture. It's just stamping for every single instance and there's not much variation. But as I start to add it to closer to rolling, then you can see the texture more present. And so I'm thinking I like this, how it looks right now. I'm going to go ahead and make the preview size bigger so I can really see what's going on with the texture. I think I like this kind of soft movement here. The scale is just going to change how big your texture is. So you can see those little hairs from the dead cat are really big, and then I can just bring them down to be much smaller. So I'm going to leave it like that. And then zoom is basically the same thing, to be honest. It's going to zoom in or zoom out, and it makes this really fluffy texture when I make the zooms at a lower percentage, but I like this larger fluffy texture here. In rotation, this will just rotate the texture as you go along. Depth will affect how clear the texture looks or how sharp it is. So if we have a low depth versus a high depth, you can see I'm starting to see a lot more of those details on the edges versus them getting kind of blurred out. So I want the depth to be pretty high for this brush. And then for the depth minimum, that just changes the range of the depth. And the depth jitter will change the depth at random times depending on your stroke. Offset jitter is something I like to keep on, and this is going to offset your texture every time you make a new stroke slightly, which is going to make it look less repetitive, which is always good. You always want a texture that doesn't repeat at all. Blend mode will change how it blends with underlying colors, which is something that you're going to have to test when you're actually working on the canvas. So I'm going to set it to multiply and leave it there. And then brightness and contrast, what this will do is affect your image. Yeah, it doesn't really affect the image there, which is unfortunate, but we can see the effect on the stroke here. So contrast is going to make your stroke generally appear sharper. I keep trying to zoom into that stroke. And as you bring the contrast down, it's going to appear softer. And then brightness, for me, bringing it down seems to make it sharper as well, like that. Then grain filtering is basically the same as before. It's going to smooth out and really make the edges nice to look at instead of jagged, depending on your source image quality. Or you can just have the improved filtering, which is going to, is going to make it look really nice and smooth. And if you have jagged image and not really that good quality, but if you have a good quality image and you want everything to be as tack sharp as it is there, then you just leave it to no filtering, which I think I'm going to do for this texture here. Now you know everything there is to know about grain. So let's go ahead and move on to rendering, which is going to be starting to get more complex. So let's get into these rendering modes, and the reason this is complex is because you're not really going to see too much of a difference. I'm actually going to pull up the handbook here so I can tell you what they are really quick, but you're not going to see too much of a difference, especially for a couple of them, especially since you're just using the drawing pad. These really start to begin to be more useful when you're using them on top of other colors and other strokes that you've actually done on your canvas. Let's start off with light glaze. This is the default Procreate blending mode. As you can see here, actually I should show you what it was on before. So intense glaze was what it was on beforehand, and then if we clear this, light glaze is the default, and so you can see this is responding to my pressure, and it's kind of creating this glazed effect where you can see my new strokes over the old ones pretty well, like that. It looks like it's lagging, but it's just because it has to keep all of this stuff in memory, so it's really not really a good experience. You really want to go back and forth into your canvas and start to experiment with these. So let's look at uniform glaze. You can see that already changes it, and so uniform glaze is similar to Photoshop. I can agree with that. If I go ahead and clear this, you can see my iPad really doesn't like this. It starts to mix a little bit. It's not exactly like Photoshop, which is what a lot of people were expecting with Procreate 5, but it's fairly close, and I think it's a good compromise because this is a lot faster than Photoshop is going to be when you're using brushes of this quality and size. So there has to be a little bit of difference there in performance. And then intense glaze is going to be bashing the colors onto the screen with a heavier touch, so it just looks like an even more intense form of uniform glaze. Heavy glaze is apparently an extremely strong blending mode. I actually like how this looks. It's very consistent. It's not as nice and smooth as the light glaze or the Photoshop one was, which is the uniform glaze. And then uniform blending is going to be combining Photoshop with a caustic approach to color, exaggerating the wet mix effect. You can play with this. I wouldn't really use this one. And then intense blending is the heaviest mode offered, great for wet brushes that smash and mix colors together. And yeah, so this is really going to depend on your painting and what you're doing already. I'm not going to go ahead and do that because this video would get way too long, but I'm going to leave it to uniform glaze because this is the one that makes the most sense to me. And let me just make sure that the brush isn't too big, and that's why it's looking like this. Some of the settings aren't even set yet, so that's probably why I'm not finding this very attractive to me right now. Here, when we go to blending, flow. So this is really cool. This is a setting that was originally only in Photoshop, and so flow changes how much of the paint is going to come out of your Apple Pencil as you paint. So this is a really nice feature to see. Everything is kind of the same thing. It looks like you just take a marker or a paintbrush and press it really hard and just smear it across, but the flow starts to actually look like you're dabbing very lightly with the brush, and then you're actually slowly bringing in the texture that way. And so if I go ahead and hit done, I'm already starting to like this brush a lot more just by adding some flow into this. And as you can see here, that shape is actually starting to be visible when we squashed the brush shape. So again, you really take the time to mess with all these settings, go back into your canvas and, try and mix and match and see all the different scenarios you can use the brush. That's why a lot of these brushes that you see people offering on the market are really, really, really great. And, they charge money for it, and it's definitely well worth it because it takes a lot of time and experience with existing traditional media to know how to make a decent brush that actually resembles something in reality. So I'm really liking how this looks right now, but I'm already thinking that I should go back and change how the texture is. But I also like this texture. I think it's cool, and it definitely would have its uses. But let's go back down here, and wet edges and burnt edges basically changes how the edges of your stroke is going to look. And so to me, I don't usually notice too much with these settings. You might see something else depending on the other settings that you have, but for me, these really aren't that helpful. I guess for the wet edges, you can see here, there's a pretty clear part where it looks super wet inside of the paint stroke. And so that's not something I'm into at all. So I'm going to leave that all the way down. Burnt edges doesn't seem to do too much. That changes the blending mode for burnt edges and blend mode. This blend mode actually, yeah, this is the blend mode for how it's going to blend on top of other colors in your canvas. So if you set a layer to color burn, I'm sure you know what that is already, but you can actually set your brush to that as well. And so that would be very, very specific case. And so I would recommend just setting it to normal. And as you can see here, my iPad is not having a good time trying to update all of this stuff. So yeah, keep that in mind. The more crazier your brush settings are, the more your drawing pad is going to lag Procreate, but it shouldn't lag nearly as much when you're actually in the canvas. And luminance blending is going to affect the color values of a brush stroke, and so you can flip it to toggle the lightness values. So with that, I think we are going to be done with rendering. Hopefully you guys can spend some time with this and figure it out in accordance with the rest of the settings, and we can go into wet mix now, which is going to be more about painting as a real life paintbrush. So I'm just going to go ahead and tell you what each of these settings actually do in a simplified way, because the description online can be kind of confusing. So for dilution, it's basically if you have a paintbrush and you mix it with water, it's going to be diluted. So that's what this effect is going to do. So dilution is going to, as you can see here, it looks like it's affecting opacity, but it's really, you really want to think of it as the dilution of the color. And then charge is going to be how much your brush loses its paint depending on how long you've made the stroke. So for me personally, I don't usually like this setting because I don't want to emulate a realistic brush. I want it to be something more, you know, digital. I want the advantage of a digital brush, and I want it to actually, you know, paint as long as I have my brush on the canvas, because I'm not going to just keep going up and down if I don't need to. Attack is going to change the amount of paint that sticks to the canvas, and so these are really subtle things that you want to use in combination with each other to really start to create realistic brush settings. Pull is going to be how much the paintbrush pulls paint that's already on your canvas into the colors. Again, you're not going to see that unless I were to paint different colors onto the canvas and show you that. You can play with these settings to get more of a realistic paintbrush effect if you want. And then grade is just going to change the contrast of your texture. Again, it doesn't seem to do too much here. If we bring it all the way down, I believe I see, no, it doesn't seem to do much for me. I also believe that these wet mix settings depend on your rendering. So you're going to want to have something that's more related to the painterly rendering styles if you want to really get into the wet mix. And then wetness jitter is just going to kind of jitter the wet approach with the brush. So it's going to mix more in a randomly way depending on how long your stroke is or your pressure and things like that. So that's wet mix. Takes a lot of experimentation. I can't really show you too much. You're gonna have to play with it yourself, but those are what those settings do. And you don't get to be good at it by knowing exactly what they do. You get to be good at it by testing and testing and testing. And so now let's go ahead and get into color dynamics. So the color dynamics settings are pretty well organized. So stamp color jitter is going to jitter the color based on every single stamp that you draw. So hue is basically the color of something. Saturation is how intense that color is. Lightness is going to make the colors appear brighter. Darkness are going to make the colors appear darker. And secondary color is going to transition the color to the original color you have to this color as you make a stroke. So let's go ahead and change hue here. As you can see, it's starting to change the hue for each stroke. And if you look really closely, you can see there's a lot of different little yellows and pinks in that. We can increase the saturation. I think this is actually decreasing the saturation. And so if we look at the stroke color jitter, that's going to change the colors based on each individual stroke. If I make a few strokes here and change the hue, you can see the strokes that I make are starting to change randomly. If I bring this down, the amount of change that happens is less. And if I bring it up, you can see this color change starts to also go into different warms and cool colors. And then here, if I bring it down, it stays within the original red that I had here. Bring that up and you can see it starts to make that change. So that's a very cool effect there. Again, saturation, lightness, darkness, that will do the same thing here, but let me actually go ahead and show you these other ones. Don't see too much happening with lightness. Darkness is pretty evident, makes the stroke much darker as you can see with this one. And then secondary color will change based on your secondary color set in Procreate. And then color pressure will change your hue based on the pressure that you have. And I really like how this looks right now. So with lighter strokes, you can see it's a much closer to the red, and with heavier strokes, it's much closer to blue, which is really interesting there. Here, saturation, you can see here, heavier strokes are whiter, lighter strokes have more color. It changes again with brightness and secondary color. I can't really think of a use for these. Some of these, they're too intricate for me, but I'm sure that a lot of people can make use of them and add a lot of cool colors to their paintings that weren't already there. If I go into color tilt, it will be the same thing. It will change based on your tilt. So let's try and see if we can make it work. As I tilt my brush, you can see that it starts to be red, start off blue, becomes red. Really cool. Really cool effects. I don't do much color stuff, so I can't really find a use for this, but I think it is a really cool thing that they have here. So I'm going to go ahead and reset all of these because I want to have this brush just to be fairly consistent for me, except I think I do like the stroke changes here and the saturation. So I'm going to leave these here. I like those subtle changes. Yeah, you can have a lot of fun with this. If you're into color, this is going to be amazing and a super fun thing to play with when you're working on your new paintings, when you actually turn these settings on for your brushes in the future. So now let's go ahead and go into dynamics. So dynamics is super easy. Basically, here speed is going to change the size of your brush based on speed. And I've never really noticed this setting too obviously. Actually, I'm going to again go ahead and hit done there and use this test brush to show you these settings. I think it'll be easier for you guys to see. And so let's go ahead again and set these to 0. Do an original brush stroke and then do a really fast one. We can see size starting to change more on this one because that one was slower, and so the size is small, fast size is bigger. You can change opacity as well. The fast strokes you can see, or the slow strokes you can see here, are losing their opacity, and the fast ones are staying very opaque. So as you can see here, these settings respond to slow strokes much more than fast strokes. So if you really want to see this change, you want to change them based on strokes that you are drawing slowly. And for here, this is jitter. It just applies overall. This is going to jitter the size of your stroke regardless of how fast you draw them, and this is going to jitter the opacity of your stroke. These settings don't do too much, but it can be useful depending on your drawing and sketching style. So now let's go ahead and go into the Apple Pencil settings, which are settings that change how your brush looks. So here under Apple Pencil is basically all of your settings for your pencil and how it interfaces with the iPad and how it works with Procreate. So as we change size, if I draw a stroke here, I can increase the size, and you will see, since we're under pressure, it will change the size as it relates to pressure a lot. And if you bring that down to 0, it doesn't really change much. And if you bring it to negative, something weird happens where your strokes are just like non-existent. So I like to keep that at max. Opacity is going to change the opacity of your stroke depending on your pressure. So if I press harder, it's more opaque, and if I press lighter, it's less opaque. Kind of hard to see since I already have the size working there for me. And then flow is going to change the kind of global amount of paint that comes out of your pencil as you paint overall. So I'm just going to leave that there for this brush since we're not using my custom brush just yet. Actually, let's go ahead and I'll switch to that afterwards. And then bleed is just going to, you can see here how much the paint bleeds out, and you can make it very dry, a very dry effect, which is really cool for some of these really more grungy brushes that you see. And then smoothing is going to smooth things out a little bit. You know, it's just depending on your taste. For me, I don't really see much use to it. And then response is going to be how fast it responds to variation in pressure. So if you start bearing down hard, you can change it to really slowly ramp up to the pressure size if you want, or you can get it to take a long time to respond to pressure. For me, I like it to be fairly quick, so I have the percentage up higher. But to be honest, these settings really don't seem to make much of an effect depending on how much streamline you have. So if you have a decent amount of streamline, the response isn't really going to change too much. So again, that's one of those settings that kind of conflicts with each other or stacks on top of each other. And then the tilt settings here are going to be affecting your overall tilt settings as you prefer. As you can see here, I'm barely doing anything when I tilt the pencil. I can just change the angle here. I can change the opacity. You can see as I move this up, the opacity of a stroke that's head on is very thick. And then when it's at an angle, it's very, very thin. Let's see what gradation does. This is basically going to make the pencil seem softer when you use the side of a pencil. So if we take opacity down again, gradation will change how soft it appears. It seems to also be doing opacity. I don't really mess too much with this because I don't really like using too much tilt. You can see bleed doesn't do too much. It looks like it's just making things lighter again in my case. And size is a pretty big deal. Usually when you use the side of a pencil, you want things to be bigger than if they were using the tip. And so that's definitely something you want to change if you want to have a very traditional, your anatomy class where you get a piece of charcoal and you start working, or a pencil, you start holding it like this. You really want to make sure that setting is there because this is basically how you shade with a pencil in those environments. Size compression, it prevents the pressure from growing with the brush size, which I think can be very, very important because a lot of the times I find myself having to go back and forth with brushes and create a duplicate where I want to use a big brush, but I don't want the texture to look ugly and huge. So this is a good thing to have turned on. So it keeps the size of your texture small when you increase the size of your brush. And just to be clear about the tilt diagram here, this basically tells Procreate how much your pencil needs to be tilted in order for Procreate to apply the tilt settings. And so if I have it at 90, you can see it's still fairly quick, to be honest. And then if I have it at 0, it still responds. So a lot of these settings don't do too much, in my opinion. So for these settings here in the brush properties, use stamp preview basically makes the preview of your brush when you're looking at the brush. Here, it just looks like a stamp versus a stroke like all of these. And then orient to screen, we're not going to really talk about that. It's this weird thing about having a brush in a specific direction and staying up or down. Not really something we need to worry about. Preview is going to change the size of the stamp in the stroke in your brush library that we just looked at, and smudge changes how much this brush is going to actually smudge. Let's actually go back to this brush. It's actually going to change how much this brush smudges when it's set to a smudge brush. And so that's definitely going to be something I'm playing with for this brush because I want to use it as a smudge brush as well as for adding a very nice feathery soft cloth kind of fur texture here, which is basically what this brush has become. The brush behavior maximum size is something I like to set very high usually because a lot of times I like to use the brush very big and also very small, and I don't want to have to come back here and change the settings. I just want to change it on the fly on the sliders, and then this changes your minimum, so I have no minimum, and the same thing happens with opacity. And so with the about this brush section, this is where you can change your name, so or change the brush name. So I can change this to fur brush right here, hit done, and then I can do made by. I can actually type my name here, ergo Josh, and then I can sign it. I have a terrible signature, but that's going to do for now. And create a new reset point is going to kind of save this brush's settings as they are now. And then so when you reset your brush, you're going to reset to this setting as it is here. And so when you do that again, it's going to reset that setting. And so it's a pretty good fail safe for keeping your brush intact. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do now, if this video isn't already too long, is I'm going to go tweak these settings and use it a little bit on the canvas and see what we have come up with. Hey everyone, I'm back from making this kind of yin and yang Tide Pod looking thing. It looks very furry, which is really cool, and I love how it looks 3D with the different kind of half moons coming together. I think in the future I would duplicate this brush and work on creating a brush I could use for more detailed strokes, whether it's a sharper texture or maybe it's just a smaller brush that I use more diligently. But I'm also really happy with how this brush performs as a smudging brush. It's very, very light and it allows me to really work my way into a lot of different textures. So thank you guys so much for watching. Remember that if you want to check out my brushes, you can look at the link in the description box below on my Gumroad page. And I hope you all have a great time working on creating your own brushes in Procreate. And I hope that this has helped you guys out and it's a lot simpler. But yeah, until next time, I will see you in a live stream. Probably you should check me out in my live streams. I do sketches usually multiple times a week, and then I might even do some art critiques here and there. If you want to check that out, look in my community page. And yeah, I'm rambling now, but yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.